Hello and welcome back to the Service Management Social, a podcast, as the name suggests, focusing on all things service management. Today, I'm joined by lead editor and author of ITIL4's Digital and IT Strategy, and one of HDI's top 25 influencers of 2021, Dave Cannon, and my business partner and managing director of ITSM Solutions, Mark Biebeck. We'll be looking at what enterprise service management actually is and how it can drive value to businesses as they look to become digital enterprises. Now, believe it or not, this is something that's widely talked about across the service management community, with many having their own opinions on what enterprise service management actually is. So Dave, let's start with you. I'll hand it over and you can tell us not only a bit about yourself, but equally what enterprise service management means to you.
Well, I think you've introduced me, so don't need to go into too much more detail. I'm based in Dallas, in Texas. So morning for me, if I get that reference wrong. So ESM, Enterprise Service Management, very interesting area, and one that's getting quite a bit of news, some of it good and some of it a little bit misleading. And I think it helps to go back to where it started and what it's all, why the term service management was chosen in the first place. So back in 40, 50 years ago, when IT was really getting going, we had a number of fairly mature installations already, mainly mainframe type installations. And a lot of the theory around how to manage these installations were exploratory. They were, what's the best model to use to manage these kind of environments? And some of the early approaches were based on a manufacturing type approach. So you have data, which is the raw material, and it goes through various machines or various stages, and it gets processed, and it comes out as a report or some sort of information. And that was likened to a factory. And so, for example, if you look at some of the early capacity management models, they were all based on queuing theory and removing bottlenecks in the assembly line, so to speak. But as things developed more and more, people began to realize, yes, there is an element of manufacturing about it, but actually managing IT is more like managing a service environment. It's very similar, for example, to managing a hospital or a restaurant or a hotel. You have very dynamic demand. People need things as they need them. They don't put in a forecast and then it gets produced. In the early days, it might have been like that. But certainly as we evolve to more sort of client-centric, customer-centric, and then eventually distributed processing and mobile phones and so on, it was very much an on-demand model and a dynamic demand model. People could request services, could request resources at any time from any source through any channel. And so this model of a dedicated manufacturing environment just didn't really work that well. So certainly when ITIL was being written, and even before that, we have people going out to other parts of the industry to find out how they manage this kind of dynamic demand. Because my background is ITIL, I'll speak to it from an ITIL point of view, and that is, very much during version 1. I certainly was not an author on version 1, but knew many of them. A lot of them actually came out of very diverse backgrounds. They were not necessarily IT people. In fact, I don't think many, if any of them, started out as IT people. They came from a diverse range of backgrounds. They came from healthcare, they came from prison services, they came from transport. And they brought that perspective of service and how to manage a service environment with them. And so the term service management became something important as a term that was used. It was not intended to just refer to the service desk or the help desk and incident management and operations management. It really referred to how you take a set of resources that a business needs and how you bring those resources and make them available to that in a format that they can consume them meaningfully. So we talk, for example, about things like incidents and so on. And, think in terms of a hospital. A&E, or for us Americans, ER. It's very much like a service desk. It functions that way. You have incidents, and then you have specialists that are dedicated to, once the diagnostic scripts have been run and people understand what they're dealing with, you have specialists that come in and help them fix whatever is going on there. That's kind of the spirit of service management. It didn't initially come from IT. It came from a business environment. And that's a theme that we're going to cover all the way through, I suspect, as we go through this podcast. It came from the business. It was adopted by IT. Now it's finding its way back into the business in many different formats. At each step that it's being transferred, it's being enriched, it's growing, it's getting more meaning, it's getting more relevance. And I think for me, ESM simply means service management. It's about how do we as an organization, as an enterprise, manage an environment that is characterized by dynamic demand, with dynamic ways of meeting that demand, or varying ways of meeting that demand, that are required at different times for different circumstances. That's, for me, what service management is about. And certainly when you apply it at the enterprise level, that is what enterprise service management is about. It's not just about, hey, we've got a great help desk. Let's create one for HR. Yeah, that you may well want to do that as part of an ESM program, but that in and of itself is not ESM.
And Mark, likewise, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what enterprise service management means to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think, thanks for the introduction. And my background is predominantly IT service management, not only running services, but also implementing services and running transformation programs that look at the organization holistically and how service is actually delivered for an IT organization and as part of wider large enterprise as well. In terms of ESM, I think the explanation that Dave has given is absolutely brilliant. And I think I just kind of, from my viewpoint, add to that. And I think it is a very good question that you've actually started off with, Chris, because as far as I know, I don't believe that there is an official definition of what ESM is. But if we look at it simplistically and say it's service management for the enterprise, well, what does that mean? And to me, I think the fundamentals are, as Dave has very eloquently put, it's about managing that web of interconnected elements that a company provides or pulls together and organizes, such as your technology, your people, and the processes that you run, as well as obviously the partners that are providing inputs to the business to actually create those outcomes that your end customer wants to consume. So enterprise service management then is about how do we do that, and how do we effectively put a set of ways of working into the organization that makes that effective for both the internal services that a business has, as well as obviously the external services that are delivered to the end customer at the end of the day. So in a succinct way, maybe saying it's about applying structure and guidance to the practices within an organization so that they can then create value for the external and internal business services.
So how does enterprise service management, or service management rather, connect with digital transformation and drive value to businesses that are looking to become digital enterprises?
That's a really good question, because very often these terms are just thrown out there. Yeah, we're doing digital transformation. Yeah, we're doing ESM, and actually they're very closely related, because digital transformation is about businesses using emerging technology, which includes IT as well as various other kinds of technology, operations technology and communications technology and so on. And these integrations of technology. So they're using new and emerging technology, but they're also using technology to do different things. So they're using it in new ways. But when it comes down to digital transformation, is all about how you change your organization to be able to operate and work and create and deliver services and products within an emerging digital context. So it's how your organization meets the challenge of, not just the challenge, takes the opportunities that digital technology has to offer them, how they change to take those opportunities. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to find that the solutions that you develop and use will need to be managed, and they'll need to be managed as dynamic services. And as you do that, you're certainly going to need to apply service management to them. But the difference is that in early days of IT, the technology was being deployed back office with some front office sort of terminals and clients and so on. Over time, that's shifted. We now have the whole of IT being developed and used almost within the business, and sometimes even within the customer in the customer's environment. So what we're finding here is that the service management techniques, processes, practices, tools not only have to be suitable for managing the technology, but they have to be suitable for managing the processes that the business is using to deliver their services and products and perform all kinds of various corporate functions. So you're using service management in a way that manages both the technology and what you do with that technology. That's the overlap between ESM and digital transformation. In fact, I don't think you can really do digital transformation unless you're applying what you've learned about managing technology to the way you're managing your business as well. I think the two are very closely related. I think a lot of people run into trouble on both sides when they try and restrict one or the other. And if they say, well, we're going to do digital transformation, but that service management stuff, that belongs in IT. So we're going to leave that there, and we're going to develop all these wonderful solutions, and we're going to develop all of these new services, and we're going to take all of these new opportunities. We don't need service management for that. That's for the techies who have to support this lot. That's where people run into a lot of trouble. That's a misunderstanding of what service management is. The other point on the digital transformation side is we get into trouble when we think that the transformation we're going through, the technologies that we're using, will not change the way we work as a business. The reality is, when you do digital transformation, when you transform something using digital technology, you actually change the rules about how your business works. Right now, that sounds a little bit strange, but think about it, take it outside of a business context. Think about today how dating works.
Yeah.
Right? The rules of dating have been completely changed because of this online thing. By the time you meet someone for the first time face to face, it's a very, very different meeting than it used to be when you kind of had already sort of bumped into each other somewhere or been introduced by friends or something like this. The rules have changed. Behavior of people has changed. There is a whole new set of crimes that are being committed in the space. People trying to extort money by getting access to their profiles and this kind of thing. The rules are different. The protections that you have to use are different. And it's no difference when you look at how you apply digital technology in the business. The behavior of people changes. The way they work together changes. The way teams across the organization have to integrate and communicate changes. And to understand these changing rules and the way not only the technology has to be managed, but the way these new practices have to be managed takes a lot of diverse skills. Service management being one of them, but certainly not the only one. So to me, that's really how they all come together.
Fantastic. And I've seen, in fact, I had a conversation earlier today with someone that works within the iGaming and online gambling, kind of within that space. And the conversation was around, I suppose, let me put it this way. Many of us see those kind of organizations as digital enterprises. But there's an element of irony in that, it's very much, the products and services that they are delivering are kind of built by them and make sense to them. But there's a real lack of focus on customer experience, the customer journey, retention. And I think to what you've just said there, the value in which it can drive is looking at the end-to-end kind of chain of services, or value chain, if you like, to ensure that not only are we delivering cool, innovative products and services, but equally they're making sense to the end customer and consumer, whether we're a digital enterprise already or we're a digital enterprise of the future, if you like.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, and that is, again, in the digital transformation context, there is a temptation in many companies who are very successful to think that because they've broken the rules and they've used this new technology and they work in a completely different way than anyone else, that therefore there are no rules.
Yeah.
And we don't have to worry about doing things like, being sensitive about diversity in the workforce, or worrying about your customers, what they think. We've got the best product. Why do we have to worry about what customers think? It's always going to be better because we're innovating all the time. But those rules still apply. Again, service management is a very important component of taking what we've learned in the past and applying it into new models. And I think you put your finger right on that. One of the things we really struggle with, or I see organizations that I work in really struggle with, is this term governance.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, there's this freedom of being able to innovate and being able to get new services and products out there and not have to, do it really quickly and in an agile, incremental fashion. And of course, we have these methodologies that help us do that. And a lot of people in those situations think, yeah, thankfully now we don't have to deal with this control and governance. It's off our shoulders. We can do whatever is good for this business. And suddenly you find people going off in all kinds of different directions, doing all kinds of different things. Some of it is good and some of it is not. Service management as part of your program helps you achieve that balance between where do we need to innovate, where do we need to get better about how we do things and what we do, and on the other side, how do we make sure that everything is coordinated and really supporting the strategy of our organization and making sure at the same time that we're all really good citizens, corporate citizens.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
But I think, back to the original question, there was, to me, and you put this very well, Dave, I think was in my mind that it talks about the convergence of digitization and the shift towards services, the shift towards consumption and using subscription-based services, whether it's as a business or whether it's as an individual. That convergence of digital and that shift to services is actually driving each other at the same time. The one enables the other, but like you've said, they actually can't be separated from each other either.
Yeah.
And of course, the important bit being that service management looks at all of these things holistically, right, across the organization, as you've highlighted.
Yeah, it really does, and you raise a very important point, Mark. Things like subscription, for example. Services in the cloud based on subscription, pay-per-use, and this kind of thing creates the illusion that people are going to, be very responsible about how they use and manage these things. And of course they're not. We tend to think, let's make our business units responsible for data storage. We'll still manage the actual services. We'll host them in the cloud. Therefore, they're a lot cheaper. But it's up to the business what they do with data. And there's this disconnect. Because on the one hand, business users and customers, people who are paying for these services, are thinking, great, I've got cheaper storage than I had before. It does, very often it doesn't go together with things like the data governance, the discipline of understanding which data needs to be stored, in what format, for how long, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And very soon you find these costs spiraling out of control. When you distribute decision making like that, you also have to distribute authority, and you also have to distribute accountability and the discipline that goes along with those things. So you raise a very important point. Subscription models are extremely positive, but they have to be managed.
Yeah.
So to the point of service management is just one of brings in those kind of disciplines which help both IT users as well as business users. In other words, everybody in the organization helps us understand exactly how and when to use and manage those technology components.
This isn't a new thing. Enterprise service management, or service management, if you like, has been, the likes of IBM, as an example, have spoken about this, and business aligned service management or service management processes across the enterprise for what, 40 years, there or thereabouts. So why do you think it's kind of more relevant and is currently being spoken about more than ever today or in recent years?
For me, I can see probably about four main kind of trends that are all driving it together. And Dave did talk to this already, but the first I would say is that business is a lot closer to IT. If you think back 10 or 20 years ago, IT was very much at arm's length. One of my favorite sitcoms of all time was actually a show called The IT Crowd. And the three main characters their office was in the basement of the building. One of my favorite lines actually was one of the characters, he picks up the phone, he says, "Hello, welcome to IT Help Desk. Have you tried restarting?" Which really typified what IT was and what IT services were. And I think, fortunately, we've moved on a lot from those days. So with IT and business now becoming a lot closer, and there's a lot more interdependence between IT and business, I think businesses and the people within the front office of the business are starting to see a lot more of the value of IT and service management of IT as how the kind of new IT crowd is really delivering services. The second point to this, I think, is that, or the second trend really, is that business leaders themselves are consuming services a lot more. So everything from obviously IT services, but let's take another example. So in the past, you probably would have bought a car, and then you're responsible for paying for services, you're responsible for paying for insurance and fuel, etc., etc. That evolved into providing cars on a lease basis, and in which maybe there was wrapped in there insurance that was a bolt-on and maintenance plan as well for your vehicle. But of course, now on an app on my phone, I can use called Zipcar. I can see 4 or 5 different cars around me in the neighborhood that are actually available for me to book and use and pay for by the minute that I rent it. I don't have to worry about insurance. I don't have to even worry about fuel. I certainly don't have to worry about maintenance for that vehicle. All I have to do is get in and drive it, and then return it to a designated parking bay that could be on the other side of the city when I'm done with it. I've only paid for the minutes that I've used of it, which is a perfect consumption-based model. And transport as a service, if we think of that, Uber, another example, world's biggest taxi company that doesn't own any vehicles and controversially doesn't employ any drivers, right? So we have many different examples that people individually are using on an ongoing basis as services, right, in all aspects of our life. I think the other trend is that increasingly services and therefore service management is seen as a source of competitive advantage, whether it's about increasing the efficiency of the internal services that a business uses between different departments, or in the external delivery of those services. And in fact, if you look at the kind of wider trends, if a business is not delivering in a services-based model, it probably is going to fall behind its competition. And then I think there's a fourth element to this, which is that the increasing kind of push from service management tooling companies that are seeing their opportunity or for additional market within the business. So for example, I know we talked briefly about, let's say, for example, an HR help desk. HR and the HR help desk is it's very easy for an HR help desk to adapt and adopt the principles from a IT help desk into that organization. So the availability of tooling, the availability of automation for businesses means that business leaders are actually seeing the benefits of adopting service management as a concept as well. So I think for me, those are the kind of four main areas that I see contributing to this increased drive in enterprise service management.
David, I was going to ask you the same question, but instead I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball if that's okay. If you take, say, M&A activity as an example, and the increase in M&A over the past 10 to 15 years, as well as external factors, be it regulation and compliance and so on, do you see even more of an impotence on service management today?
Yes, it is from many different points of view. You mentioned mergers and acquisitions first. One of the most important things to do is to make sure that two organizations are able to identify what they do, who does it, where it gets done, when it gets done, and how they do it, and bring those together. And it's very difficult to do that if you don't have for want of a better word, a kind of framework to identify the standard components that should be in every organization. And every discipline has those. If you look at financial, legal, HR, those are very clearly understood, and for IT as well. And for IT, it's not only about service management. Of course, there are other components as well. There's the technology architectures and so on that have to be dealt with. But certainly, service management is and has been for many organizations a huge benefit to being able to make those mergers and acquisitions a lot easier. They're never easy, but make it a lot more easy and manage it more effectively. I certainly think that. In terms of regulation, this is a really interesting one where regulation has always been the focus on regulatory requirements has always been compliance, right? So there's this regulation over there. We need to comply with it in our organization. And 90 to 99% of effort is focused on auditing and compliance. And what we're seeing, though, is very interesting, is that there are some organizations out there, typically startups, that are saying, regulation is there for an important reason. It kind of protects everybody. It makes sure that everybody's kept honest. But at the same time, let's think about the compliance, but let's also think about the opportunities that regulation brings. For example, during this pandemic, where people in banks, for example, people couldn't get down to the branch. So how do you produce your identification to, do things like open accounts or add someone as a signatory to your account or whatever? Yeah. And what we found is that there are companies who said, compliance, if you take a compliance-based view of regulation, you're not going to be able to do business in this environment. But there are those organizations who said, we understand why regulation is there. It's important that we know who we're dealing with and that we can prove that the person is who they say they are. Let's find a way to do that. And that way invariably has been through technology. And so what's happening is that as a result of governance and regulation increasing and becoming more rigorous in many places, you're seeing a lot more organizations viewing regulatory requirements not only as a compliance issue, but also as a competitive advantage issue. And I think service management helps you identify how to do that, because what service management does is it starts from the end of the chain and says, what are you trying to do? And then it works all the way back through the chain and says, well, how are we going to do that? What are the obstacles we need to overcome? How do we overcome each one? And how do we manage that from the front to the back of what we're doing? So service management, I think, has become a very important thing to do. Now, I know a lot of people don't call it service management. They'll tend to use all kinds of terms, depending on which background they come from, some people would say, well, we're doing value stream mapping to do that. Well, fine. It doesn't really matter what technique you use. But what you're doing is you're using service management to ensure that you have linked the whole value chain, if you like, from where the value is realized all the way through to where the components are built or procured. That's a really important part of that. So yeah, I mean, service management is really becoming more and more of a competitive differentiator for organizations.
Okay. So if service management is now seen as something that's driving real business value, do you see disciplines and functions within ITSM adopting more of an enterprise role? And I suppose to caveat that question, how do you see business functions adopting service management?
We're seeing a bit of both. And it's an interesting question you ask, because as with everything, a lot of people look at service management as a kind of textbook thing. Here are some practices that you need to implement. In reality, service management is more of a political issue than anything else. It's about how do we get people to work together to make the right decisions and to do the right work to make our organization successful. Those are political decisions. And so the answer to that question has as much to do with, what's the value of using a service management approach to how willing are people to work together to achieve the business objectives. We'll go back to the IBM question that you asked, and that is that IBM mentioned value contribution of IT over 40 years ago. They certainly did, and I have to say that IBM was one of the foundational components of what became ITIL. Some of their input were foundational to what became ITIL. The point, though, was that the groups that built the building blocks for value were in one group, and the group that delivered or realized the value were in another group. In the early days, the linkage between those two groups was through application development teams and project teams. It was assumed that if the project team built the application that met that service requirement, that value would be realized. Only the problem was when it was rolled out into operation, nobody really communicated with the people who operated those services, what they were and why they were so important and what they did. So we had to put in place all kinds of middle functions like service desks and so on to try and get that point across. Business relationship management evolved as a very important component to communicate the value across between these different groups. And it was a very formal kind of process because these two groups were different groups, and there were usually more than two. They were different groups, and so bringing them together and uniting them was a very awkward and time-consuming and sometimes very politicized process. What we have happening now is those groups are being formed in multifunctional teams, aligned under a project owner, who are responsible not only for their piece of building the value, but they're responsible for contributing to the success of the entire chain. And because of that, we're certainly seeing more and more prevalence of service management practices finding their way into business practices. What we're also doing is finding more and more business practices finding their way into the IT groups. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, as a unit, ITSM is finding itself being transplanted or moved or adopted as a unit within a business unit. But what I would say is that many of the practices are certainly finding their way into this new type of organization that is emerging as digital technology impacts us. That being said, we still have, most organizations have a traditional IT department. And it is really important that that traditional IT department starts to learn service management and how it applies within a business context. They need to overcome that gap if it still exists. So, sorry, just to take a bit of a detour there. There are really two approaches to do that. The approach that many of the tool vendors would love you to take is the let's call it the type 2 approach. I'll start with the second one first. The type 2 approach is where you take a single process or a single function and you move it across into the business. Create a help desk for HR. I call it the HR service desk. So we take a little bit of incident management, we apply it across. We take a little bit of the, the way our service desk in IT works, and we use the same tools for the HR service desk that we use on our IT help desk, and that is fantastic. Vendor walks away with double license revenues. We have a better functioning HR department. We're doing ESM. Well, no, what you're really doing is you're transplanting, or you're applying one part of service management to another. And that's really that's when you mention that the business units are adopting ITSM. That's the kind of thing that's happening there. But I think by far the greater value comes out of the type 1, which is the true enterprise, which is when the executives of the organization, starting with the CEO, maybe even with the board, the governing body of the organization, and says, I know we are this type of organization. I know we're in business to do this, but there are elements of a service management approach which will really help us to get this organization, this business, more competitive, more efficient, more effective, faster, more relevant to our customers. And if we use those disciplines and those practices within our organization, we're going to be a better organization for it. That is the true enterprise service management. And I think the first one is more of a grassroots type approach, where individual, and of course I don't want to belittle those in any way. They're very important, right? Getting efficiency and getting more effective departments in any part of the organization is of course a worthy objective. You should go for it. But if it's grassroots, it's only going to happen. It's going to have limited effect.
Yeah.
If you think about it, many of the first ITSM practices emerged as a grassroots thing, right? We did it because we had to get our incidents under control. Things were just spinning out of control. We had to put incident management in place. 30, 40 years later, still that's the most important thing on our agenda. If you really want traction for service management across the enterprise, it has to be driven from the executive's organization, through the product owners of the organization, through the team leads of the organization, and consistently across the whole organization. Otherwise, it's going to be hit and miss, and it will end up being just a number of grassroots efforts. And grassroots efforts, for the most part, some of them do result in innovation that changes the whole organization, but for the most part, grassroots efforts result in operational improvements primarily, and they're limited to those parts of the organizations who buy into them, and it's not mandatory. So a lot of the organization does not buy into them, and therefore you have this fragmentation happening.
And Mark, both you and David have touched upon HR throughout the duration of today's conversation, and one would assume that's primarily because of the way in which that business function specifically consumes IT services. But if we were to put the spotlight onto HR as a business unit, how can you see them, as an example, adopting service management practices to enable better performance and ways of working?
Look, I think, following on from what Dave said about the two different elements to it being grassroots and it being enterprise. But if we take HR as a good example of that, yes, you can look at an element such as how do we deal with HR requests, for example, for payslip information, change of personal details. How do you optimize that so that it's a lot easier, or even providing self-service to your employees? All of those elements, absolutely, you can borrow that entirely from frameworks such as ITIL. But I think in terms of looking at the broader context of HR and saying, okay, well, how would we define what HR does as a portfolio of services that we provide to our customer, which is the employees of the organization, and taking the aspects of looking at those services? How do we define services, the who, the what, the why, the when of those services that you then provide to the employees of the organization? And then bringing in all the other aspects that are there that help to really support what services and how services are delivered, looking at things, everything from your strategic planning cycle of services, how you stand those up and deliver them, through to looking at things like how do you manage the cost of your services? How do you charge the business for your services? All of those different elements, those absolutely are all translatable from ITIL into a business service, whether it's HR, finance, legal, whatever that happens to be.
So if we remove IT from ITIL, say, does it make it fit for business purposes?
I mean, considering that ITIL is informed guidance, right, of a way of doing things, but that needs to actually be applied in any environment, whether you in an IT environment or other. You need to actually adapt that to work for the specific and unique needs of your organization, right? So the same principle applies whether you're applying it within the IT part of the business or another part of the business, in my view. Dave, you probably have a much better way of putting that.
I don't know. I think you put it very well. It's a question that has been asked, oh my goodness, since version 3 of ITIL. And already then people were talking about, yes, we can apply this in the business. It is a business service management approach. Yet when you get a business person to read an ITIL book, certainly in version 3, they say, well, this is too technical for me. So I think you have to ask the customers about this, the people who are actually in the business who we asked to read an ITIL book. I think it certainly has gotten more business focused, but remember that ITIL is a best practice, as Mark says. It's guidance. It comes out of best practice. It comes out of what people have done. And so ITIL will only reflect a business service management view if that is what is going on in the industry, if that's where the industry is headed. And I think it is headed that way. Are we there yet? No, I don't think so. We still have too many discrepancies between the way that business units want, work and manage themselves and the way that IT units work and manage themselves. And I think we're still too hung up on trying to communicate between these two. I think to the extent that IT people become more business professionals, they become a business professional with a tech specialization. To that extent, we'll start seeing ITIL becoming more and more relevant within business context. However, there is something to be said here, and that is, to the extent that more and more of the business is automated using technology, ITIL is relevant. Now, it's not to say that service management is not relevant. It's relevant to the whole enterprise, as we've already said. It's just, how does IT apply the concept of service management? How does a business unit apply the concept of service management? And how can they do that together? And I think we still got a long way to go in that. I do have an example of this. A friend of mine is currently working on a program in Chile. I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning. I won't mention names or places. The exercise that he started working on started in the legal department. And it was, how can we apply the concepts of service management into the whole nest of compliance and reporting and contracts and so on? How do we manage this? How do we make sense of all of this? Given that we're managing all of this on behalf of a number of business units throughout the organization, very similar kind of challenges that, for example, an IT group would have. They made a number of very interesting breakthroughs, but for me, the really interesting one was with reporting and data. So one of the exercises was they went through all of the corporate divisions and they said, what reports do you produce every month? And where do you get the data from to produce those reports? Well, of course, as it turns out, as you probably know, that every department went to every business unit head with a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint or a Word document every month and said, we need you to complete this template with this data. Very often it was the same data. Very often it came from the same source. Sometimes it came from different sources. But these business unit leads were spending a week a month with a full-time staff to support the whole process, generating the information needed for these reports. When this ESM program looked at this and said, but hold on, what if we take a look at all the reports and all of the data needed for all of those reports and map them? That way, you can take whatever report you need whenever you like, provided the business unit leads have the data up to date. And so the focus shifts from, hey, you need to be reporting for compliance to, hey, here's a bunch of data that you're using to operate your business. We're going to report on it as well. So if you don't keep it up to date, your reports aren't going to look so good. But and so the whole focus shifted. And I think what you find, I have some psychology studies in my background. And one of the things we talk about is locus of control. Internal locus of control versus external locus of control. An external locus of control is someone who believes or does things because they're told to by someone outside of themselves, and they're always struggling because they have to comply with what that person is telling them to do. An internal locus of control is someone who says, I have this objective I want to meet. How am I going to do this? Takes control of it and actually figures out how to get it done. What happens in these organizations when they move to an ESM model is they move very much from an external locus of control where everybody's doing things because they have to, because they're being told to, because the process says so, to more of an internal control. Hey, here's the objective. Here's what we're trying to achieve. How can we do this better if we work together on it, if we figure out a way to do it? And that, for me, was a very good example of that shift taking place within this organization.
Great. So we've covered quite a bit off today. But just to kind of finish up, have either of you got any closing statements to summarize firstly what we've discussed, and then more broadly speaking, once again, what enterprise service management means to you? Dave, we'll start with you, and then Mark will come on to you.
How do you sum up something so complicated in just one word? I think it's very difficult. I would say, as always, ESM is about becoming a fully rounded business professional. Whether you start out on the business side and work into the technology area, or whether you start in the technology area and work out into the business side, it takes a well-rounded business professional to do this. And the service management that you're looking at has learnings from both the technology application of it as well as the business applications of it. There are many. And to have a really good ESM program, you really need to be familiar with the learnings of service management from every context in your business, and how to get them to work together. I think that's what it boils down to for me.
And Mark, for you?
Yeah, I think to me it's considering that the services economy is here and here to stay, and that we are moving at pace in that direction across all industries, and combined with that, the increased convergence that we spoke about earlier of IT in business and digitization of business. I think businesses will need to consider holistically how they manage both their internal and external services that they deliver across the organization, whether they use a framework to do that, or whether they apply principles of continually learning and improving from what they've done in the past. Ultimately, businesses will need to do that in order to remain relevant in the future.
Well, look, I'd like to thank you both for joining me this afternoon. I think it's been a really great conversation, and certainly something that I've learned a lot from, and I'm sure those that have tuned in will take quite a bit from as well. But just as importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listeners, viewers, for tuning in.